Good morning from Washington, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We still have some folks trickling in to the Zoom, but I did want to get started here because we've got a packed agenda and a really great panel. And I want to make sure we have plenty of time for all of our speakers. So welcome. I'm Erin Sikorsky. I am the director of the Center for Climate and Security in Washington, D.C. And for those of you who don't know, CCS, the Center for Climate and Security, is a nonpartisan institute of the Council on Strategic Risks. And as our title suggests, we're focused on the nexus of climate change and national security. So we facilitate policy development processes and dialogues, we conduct research, we communicate to the public, and we act as a resource hub in the climate and security field. As a reminder, today's event is on the record and will be recorded. And I'm going to provide some just brief introductory remarks to set the stage for the conversation before turning it over to my friend and colleague, Sherri Goodman. We're really lucky to have her today to lead today's conversation with our fabulous panel. And I also want to give a big thank you to my colleague, Brigitte Hugh, who has made this all happen today. And without her, we wouldn't all be here. But so as I said, I wanted to provide some context for this discussion. Why are we hosting this conversation? And if you're signed into the Zoom, you know that rarely a day goes by without the impacts of climate change featuring in the top headlines of major news outlets. Just this week, we saw two new reports that looked back at 2021 and captured the unprecedented nature of the climate risks we're facing now in the United States. We had NOAA release its annual assessment of climate disasters here in the States, and they reported 20 separate climate disasters that cost over $1 billion a piece. We also had the Copernicus Institute in Europe release its assessment of how hot last year was. It was the 5th hottest year on recorded history on the planet. And they also measured that the previous 7 years were the 7 hottest years on planet Earth. And we saw that in this past year, we saw militaries deployed around the world to respond to these shocks. Wildfires in California, in North Africa, in Turkey, flooding in China, in Germany, drought, hurricanes, typhoons, the list goes on. And we also increasingly see these climate-related issues contributing to risks of conflict, instability, and geopolitical competition. At the same time, though, the good news, I think, is that 2021 was a year in which the issue of climate security really took main stage in nearly all international security conversations. From the US government and President Biden's initial executive order last January, putting it front and center in foreign policy, to NATO, to the UN Security Council, to the US Congress and the recently passed National Defense Authorization Bill, all of these areas talked about climate change and climate security as a priority. And as we look to 2022, our priority at CCS is to help policymakers move from analysis and recognizing the risks to action, right? What are the concrete steps we can take to address climate security risks? And to that end, adaptation and resilience measures designed to manage the near-term threats that are already baked into the system are critical, as are measures aimed at mitigation and cutting emissions to ensure that we avoid the most catastrophic security outcomes in the second half of the century. And so our discussion today with this fabulous panel is squarely focused on that mitigation question. How can the United States leverage a whole of government response to tackling some of the most hard to decarbonize sectors? Why is this important for US national security? What is the role of the Defense Department and the defense industrial base in driving market demand for clean energy technologies? What are the operational benefits to our military of doing so? And how can the State Department, private industry, and DoD find synergies to address these issues together? So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Sherri, and thanks again for joining us, and thanks to the panel for being here.
Okay, thank you very much, Erin. That was very well said and a great context for this discussion. And I want to thank you and Brigitte, and especially thank everyone who's joined us today, and especially our terrific panelists. So, against the urgency of the climate crisis and the ambition of this administration and other nations around the world, one of the important elements in tackling the climate crisis is the First Movers Coalition that our first speaker, Varun, has been formative in developing. And I was excited when I saw this come out because I know, first of all, I know how smart Varun is. So I know that something that he is put his hands on has got to be good, okay? And he's working for Secretary Kerry and a great team. But second, having spent so much of my life working in and around the Defense Department and the defense industry, I know the power of the military to lead by example. Also, we know our military is the nation's single largest federal energy user and one of the largest emitters of greenhouse gases. So it has a challenge, but it has a great opportunity in this race to the top to use its buying power across some of the key sectors that are in the First Movers Coalition that are reflected in the needs of military operations, from aviation to shipping to trucking and beyond. And that's where Joe Bryan, is the perfect representative for the Secretary of Defense. I mean, we're very fortunate as a nation to have him as the Secretary's special advisor for climate change and energy, because Joe is very experienced. He knows the energy and climate field. He understands energy and supply chains in defense extremely deeply. And also, he's just a good guy and people like working with him, which is important when you're in DOD, because you got to build trust to get anything done. Okay, and now, so I'm very excited about this event today, because now we also have some great colleagues from the defense industry. We've got Brian Moran from Boeing, Boeing is actually formally in this First Movers Coalition. So we knew we needed somebody representing the aviation industry, and Brian has a deep experience in this field as the head of global sustainability policy and partnerships for Boeing. He's worked in the US and in Europe, and he understands the whole totality of the landscape, which I think is very, very important. And then Mike DeWitt at Northrop, one of the leading defense companies, also in a sustainability role, and also stepped up to really lead and tell us how Northrop's thinking about it in the defense industry. And then finally, I'm very pleased that we've got Anshu Roy, who is the founder and CEO of Rhombus Power, that has an AI capability working in the defense sector to help us better manage and track and understand what progress we're making here, because I think that's so important. At the end of the day, we've got to show, what are the accomplishments. This is about moving from analysis and the policy commitments to action, and Anshu's got a set of tools to help do that. So with that, and knowing also that Varun, our first speaker, our very talented first speaker, and is also got a time constraint, we want to turn right to him. I think he has to leave at 10:30, he said, to brief the Secretary of Energy. So we want to let him do that and be able to tell her what great progress the defense sector is making on the race to net zero and to decarbonize the economy. So with that, over to you, Varun.
Well, thank you, Sherri. Thanks for the invitation, Aaron. Sherri, you are far too kind. I really appreciate the chance to come over here and talk with everyone. What I'll do is I will share my screen sharing is disabled. So if you're able to enable it, I've got some slides to show. But let me just talk a little bit about the First Movers Coalition that we launched at COP26. President Biden dedicated one of the 5 or 6 major U.S. announcements at COP26 to this initiative, and it was fascinating. At COP, President Biden actually dug into the slides, some of which I was about to show you, because he was so interested in this ability for the United States, in partnership with the World Economic Forum, to convene some of the world's biggest companies. Thrilled to have Boeing. Great to have you on, Brian. The companies that ended up joining us are valued at $6 trillion, 34 leading companies. Let me try sharing my screen now. I think this is going to work. Sherri, can you see that?
Yes.
Great. So
good.
I'll just give a quick rundown of what the coalition is. It aims to bring together the purchasing power of these major companies to do something we haven't done before, to send a clear demand signal for innovation. Because we say that roughly 50% of the emission reductions we'll need by 2050 have to come from new technologies. Now, at COP, we had a wonderful launch. Secretary Kerry, President Biden, you'll see here European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, Bill Gates, and a range of leading CEOs in the World Economic Forum did this launch. It was widely covered in the media. This was one of the United States' top announcements. And the reason is that it is attacking these hard to abate sectors: shipping, aviation, steel, cement, aluminum, trucking, with the largest demand signal in history for new technologies. The inspiration behind this was what we did for vaccines. Advanced market commitments for vaccines enabled us to bring these vaccines to market in record time. Similarly, we did advanced market commitments, or a related policy tool called milestone payments, that brought commercial spaceflight to reality through SpaceX. Now in the energy sector, these private sector companies sent a clear demand signal that they promised to buy in this decade technologies that will help us to decarbonize hard to abate sectors where there are no cost-effective alternatives to fossil fuels today. Here is the full list of the founding members. And then the final slide I'll just quickly show you is, here is the theory of the case. What we do with the First Movers Coalition is create this early market in this decade by 2030. Every single company has committed to buy in aviation, shipping, steel, or trucking, new technologies that are not commercially viable today, but should be commercially viable starting in 2030 to enable us to achieve a massive scale up, so that in 2050, 50% of the emissions reductions we'll need will come from these emerging technologies. The demand signals we send today on the right-hand side through those sectoral buyers clubs will induce the suppliers or the innovators to develop and scale those new technologies. I'll walk through a couple quick examples, but let me go ahead and stop sharing for now. To give you a couple examples, in the aviation sector, and that's where Boeing has joined us along with United Airlines and Salesforce and Apple. They've made the commitment that 5% of their jet fuel demand in 2030 is going to be displaced by next generation technologies that can reduce emissions by 85% or more. Those technologies are not in the market today. Even today, sustainable aviation fuels won't get you to that threshold. What you need are truly innovative technologies that will need to get the aviation sector to net zero by 2050. And that's the same case for shipping, where Amazon's committed that 10% of its deep sea ocean shipping is going to be on zero emissions ships with zero emissions fuels. In steel, Volvo is committed that 10% of its steel that it procures to make vehicles is going to come from zero emission steel. There's only one plant in the world that makes zero emission steel today, but we're going to need dozens more by 2030. So that's the theory of the case, what the First Movers Coalition is doing. This year, we will increase its size. We'll bring new members onto the coalition, and we'll add new sectors, including aluminum, cement, and direct air capture. Now, for this particular group, I just want to make a couple of tailored points when it comes to the defense context, as Sherri laid out. The first is that we have a lot to learn from the Defense Department and the national security sector generally, because the Defense Department kind of pioneered these advanced market commitments or demand signals that have enabled us to bring new technologies to market. I think, for example, about semiconductors in the post-World War II era. It was the Defense Department that created demand signals for those new technologies that have then filtered in to other consumer technologies. And semiconductors is a wonderful example. The second thing that Sherri said that I want to double click on is some of these sectors actually have national security implications. So as you know, the Defense Department, and I'd love to hear from Joe on all this, has historically invested in next generation fuels for ships and planes. These fuels that we're developing have the potential to provide an alternative to the supply chains that we currently rely on that are petroleum based. But those are just two national security focus points I'd make. I think the biggest lesson is we have a great deal to learn from the national security community based on all the success on purchasing and demand signals. And I hope we have something to contribute to American national security through the technologies we develop in the First Movers Coalition. I'd love to, rather than talk at everyone, I'd love to answer any questions anyone on the panel or the audience has. Again, sincere apologies that I've got to jump off at 10:30. Thanks so much for the invitation, Sherri.
Hey, Varun, that was so great. And thank you for such a succinct and powerful overview. And I think in the time that we have with you, I'd really like to bring in the other panelists and have a discussion. First, maybe Joe, you could give us just a brief, maybe not your whole talk, but any questions you want to ask to Varun, or where you think DoD's demand signal can most contribute in areas of military operational capability. And then I want to let our private sector representatives also ask a question of Varun.
Thanks, Sherri. So I know Varun's got to run, so rather than me go into kind of the whole background that I was going to talk about, I think thanks for putting this together. Varun, I think that, you know, I think you're probably best described as the first mover of the First Movers Coalition. So I'm sure there's some sort of award in your future for being in that role. You and your boss, John Kerry, it's just great work. I think Varun, I'll just emphasize a couple points Varun made. One, the Department of Defense has a lot of scale. We have a lot of demand. And we have traditionally been effective at moving certain markets. Some of those markets have changed over the years, and we're not as big a player as we used to be, and we don't have the same market power in some sectors that one that we used to have, or that one we wish we had, so we could move those markets more. But we do have a tremendous procurement power, and many of these technologies have very significant national security implications. And we'll just talk about aviation for one of them, because and I think both Boeing and Northrop can speak to this. You know, we have 2/3 of Department of Defense's energy use is in operations, and 2/3 of that is in aviation. So we have a huge fuel demand in operations and huge fuel demand in aviation, and the associated greenhouse gas emissions are massive. We have there are significant benefits to improving the efficiency of our current fleet. We're working on things like drag reduction, but there's all kinds of innovation that we need to rely on to get to where we really need to go. A lot of good work, and I'd love to hear from Boeing, Northrop on electric aviation. I mean, I think we're a ways off from having manned defense missions with electric aviation, but certainly at the edges, it's starting to come. And with battery, with solid state batteries and battery power densities improving over the next decade, we'll see where that goes. So there's a lot of potential there. There's also a lot of opportunity. I know Boeing's done some work on this in different body types. When do we move away from tube and wing body and get into other forms of aircraft, which can bring with them kind of fundamental changes in the fuel demand of the air fleet? And so that's really important. And I think the last point I'll make, and I don't want to, we can get into it after Varun departs a little bit more, but all of these things are not only important, as Sherri mentioned, to our climate ambitions. They're actually really critical for our mission, because to the extent that we are operating in areas like the Pacific, which are challenged by a tyranny of distance and by very complex logistics to get fuel to where we need to use it, any improvement we make to efficiency, any improvement we make that reduces our demand for logistic support is not only great for the climate, something we all care about, but it also happens to be really good for the mission. So I often say, even if you don't care about climate change, even if you're one of those folks who just doesn't believe the science, which is very, very clear, there's still a reason to do this stuff. The US should be at the cutting edge of aerospace technology, and we need to improve in order to be successful at the military's mission. And so those are the points that I'd make at the onset for Varun, and we can get to a deeper discussion about fuels and specific technologies. Over to you, Sherri.
Okay, thank you so much, Joe. Varun, do you want to respond to that, or would you like to hear from Brian, Mike, and Anshu?
Let me just say one quick thing. I'm so sorry I'm messing up the format of the panel, but let me just say one quick thing. To what Joe said, DoD has enormous procurement power. More broadly, the US government has enormous procurement power, as do countries around the world. We're working with them. The key thing when it comes to the First Movers Coalition is to target procurement. So for example, you might say the federal government will reduce the embodied carbon in the construction of its new buildings. And that won't send as targeted a demand signal for zero carbon concrete, because you could do things that are more efficient with your building materials, but really don't require new technologies. A demand signal that's focused on bringing a new technology to market looks different. In many cases, it has to be sort of technology specific, but in the First Movers Coalition, we've done our best to say, look, in clean steel, try and get this whatever method you want, just get below a certain emissions threshold that you can't meet using today's technologies. And so you might use hydrogen, you might use molten oxide electrolysis and electricity. The idea is we have to get beyond just public procurement that would reduce emissions to public procurement that will force technology to come to scale. And I think the Defense Department is uniquely qualified to do it given their track record. And I think the rest of our government can learn a lot from what Joe and the Defense Department do.
Okay, that's great, Varun. So maybe that's a perfect opening now for Brian and then Mike to talk about, those new technologies that you want to bring to market to get over the valley of death, not just meeting some of the climate and net zero commitments through efficiency or other non-procurement methods.
Yeah. Hey, perfect. First, also big thanks to CCS for convening us. Varun, thanks to you and the Special Envoy team for really pushing the envelope into COP. Boeing was delighted to join in so many ways, especially on sustainable aviation fuels, which I'll talk about in a second. We felt like we were part of a first mover movement. So thanks for bringing us along. And I'm delighted to share the stage with Joe, Anshu, and Mike, great colleagues. So look, at Boeing, we humbly try to connect, protect, and explore the world and do so sustainably and safely. And on sustainable aerospace, really, it's 4 pillars for us. It's fleet renewal. And Varun, very much your point, it's current technology into new technology. On the commercial side, every airplane we bring to market is 15 to 25% more fuel efficient. That is a ton, right? At a time when we're chasing every percent of fuel burn, 50 to 25 is a lot. But on the defense side, the same counts. Re-engineering the B-52, bringing the T-7 trainer to market for the Air Force through digital manufacturing, digital assembly, cutting the assembly time down by 80% and improving quality by 75% at the same time. That's sort of breakthrough innovation as part of our fleet renewal franchise. The second is operational efficiency. And when you look at, and I very much heard you just now, Varun, Boeing reached net zero in our own operations in 2020. And so I think there are some opportunities where we can compare notes with the department on how to do things more efficiently. But it's also how we operate our products, right? If you look at airspace management, using digital technologies in the cockpit to fly more continuous approaches on the civil side, but also leverage some of the civil technologies on the defense side on wind updates, fuel dashboards, just flying more efficiently can gain you a lot. Every percent counts in this space. The third, and that's back to Joe's point on advanced technology, our third pillar, it's future studies. To your point, Joe, on new and innovative concepts with NASA, such as the transonic truss brace wing that we're working on. But it's also in what the FMC calls near zero emissions propulsion technologies. And here on hydrogen, we have a lot of experience in hydrogen propulsion. We've flown high altitude, long endurance drones, the Phantom Eye on liquid hydrogen. We've flown Scan Eagle drones on hydrogen fuel cells. We've flown a 2-seat commercial airplane in 2008 on a hydrogen fuel cell. And then of course, the logistics behind hydrogen, where we learned a lot from our space business, all that is informing our thinking on how we might apply hydrogen on a commercial side and eventually a defense side. But we also see a lot of limitations there, which is why we're really getting to our fourth pillar and the one I'll end on, and that's renewable energy, in particular SAF. On the civil side, 80% of the missions that we fly electric and hydrogen don't really apply. So it is sustainable aviation fuels. And with Varun's vision, what we've committed at FMC is go after the type of fuels that are 85% or higher life cycle carbon reduction. Boeing from the get-go, and this is a nice inflection point with the DoD, we were there in 2008, a bit as a first mover when the first flight took place on the 747 on SAF. In 2011, the Navy flew an F-18 Hornet on sustainable aviation fuel, calling it the Green Hornet. So very much to your point on early signals from the Navy and the certification and the standards that go with that. But then, we committed as a company that by 2030, all of our commercial airplanes will be capable of flying on 100% SAF blend. Currently, the limit is 50%. So we have some work to do over the next 10 years to get to 100% SAF in those fuel tanks. And I see great opportunity to partner with DoD to scale SAF, to send those demand signals, and to do so in a sustainable way. We often get the question on the type of feedstock. Very encouraged by the type of language coming out of the White House, also looking at a bio-based, sustainable feedstock. And then lastly, the policies that go with that. If you look at the blender's tax credit that's making its way through Congress right now, incentivizing oil companies to blend this type of fuel is, I think, another big opportunity for us that we may be able to talk about later. But again, a big thanks to the FMC for leading from the front and for allowing us to be part of it.
Okay, thank you. That was great, Brian. I'm going to turn right over to you, Mike, in the hope we could get Mike and Anshu to have both weigh in a little bit while Varun's still on the line.
Yeah, well, Varun's still on.
I apologize. I'm going to have to jump off, but Mike, I look forward to catching up with you and Anshu, and thanks so much, everybody.
Yeah, look forward to that. Thanks, Varun.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Varun. It was great to have you here. Okay, well, Mike, perfect. Jump in on how Northrop envisions its efforts in this area.
Sure. And thank you, Sherri and Aaron and the team at CCS. This is really a good opportunity to share some perspectives from industry on this topic whose importance has really been underscored, not just by the esteemed panel members that you see here this morning, but you can't open up the Times or the Post or the Journal and not see a plethora of articles and thought pieces on this very important topic. So it's good that we have yet another platform from which we can have these conversations. And so as a leader within our industry, we at Northrop Grumman really want to understand and take responsibility for the opportunities that we have, because we believe we're in an industry that holds a lot of value and holds a lot of potential when it comes to the development and implementation of clean technologies. And really now more than ever, our partnership with the government, especially the Department of Defense and Joe and his team over there, to really focus on how we can develop and implement solutions that address the challenges that I think have been very clearly articulated by the administration through the series of executive orders that we've seen this in 2021 and then action continuing to 2022. This clear articulation of goals really helps organizations like ours to develop and align roadmaps to what the DoD is saying is important. And I'm specifically referencing the climate adaptation plan that was published late last year, because this really does enable the co-development of a roadmap to what that low carbon future looks like. We really want to focus on, if you value an outcome and you want to drive the behaviors, you need to establish aggressive goals. And so just reflecting a little bit on history, back in 2015, we announced our focus on the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, water, and waste into landfills. And we've achieved a significant amount of progress as it relates to reducing our greenhouse gas emissions by 44% in the last 10 years. And what that does is it gives us a springboard to move forward and to, again, work with the partners, and more on partnerships in a second, but it enables us to work with partners and gives us the credibility to work with partners like the DoD to focus on these topics. The familiar saying of a rising tide raises all ships, and really the pun is intended there. I think it rings quite true here. And also the African proverb of, if you want to go fast, you go alone, and if you want to go far, you go together, really can't be more relevant in a situation like this, because this is where our partnerships, public, private, NGO partnerships, are showing real promise for how we can go together. And as leaders and the leaders and organizations that were represented here today, this is our commitment to seeing, taking the role of technology leaders to enable the achievements that we see and we feel are most important. So what is it more specifically are we doing? So we've heard SAFs mentioned, hydrogen electrification. I'm not going to repeat what Brian has covered and Varun covered prior to his departure in this discussion. But what I want to focus on, maybe in addition to that, is the role of supply chain, because we expect our supply chain partners to have a particular focus on improved risk management. And this includes performance and transparency. And we expect our suppliers to support our company, and I would imagine others do the same thing, but to support Northrop Grumman, a commitment to operate as responsible stewards of the environment. It's good for business, it's good for the environment, and it's good for society. And so our enterprise terms and conditions really include a focus area, and we have specific provisions that require compliance with our standards of business conduct. And this has really driven an understanding, again, talking about going far and going together. This mutual understanding really focuses our conversation in areas that it may not have gone before. And so deploying initiatives maybe focused on reducing our Scope 3 emissions for our US-based activities. Scope 3 emissions are, of course, a significant topic of the day, and working with our partners both up and downstream on the upstream end with our suppliers, on the downstream end with our customer, we can aggregate and consolidate and pool our products in ways that we've been able to reduce Scope 3 emissions tied to our domestic supplies. And this is but one example. There's many, many others that we could highlight, but I just wanted to focus on the role of partnerships and how that partnership, the commitment to collaboration is really what helps us to explore the opportunities and to drive significant progress as it relates to the broader greenhouse gas emissions profile of not just our industry, but all of industry. So I'll hold my comments now because I know we're tight on time, Sherri, but any other topics and conversation as part of this conversation, looking forward to entertaining those questions, but I want to give the others some time to also opine on this really good question.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mike. That was great. Now I'm going to turn the floor over to Anshu to say how you think you can help and companies like yours can be helping DoD meet its climate commitments. And after which I'm going to let Joe come back and sort of have some questions or opportunities to respond to what our industry reps have said. And then I know we've got some really good questions in the chat, so I want to get to those as well. Okay, Anshu, over to you.
Hey, Sherri, thank you for having me in this panel, and I really am honored. And I want to say that it's a real pleasure to be here with Brian and Joe and Mike and Erin and Brigitte. Thank you for your help. So what I want to say is that every sector that has committed in its own way towards helping meet COP26 goals now has to contend the challenge of trying to meet those promises. And we heard from Brian and Mike about the steps that these companies are taking in tackling these challenges. And what you realize, and as I hear them and I think through this, there are really two parts to it. One is the current operations, as they talked about, which is how do you bring optimization and efficiency into it, and some sort of incremental innovations in there, which can add up to breakthroughs over time. And then there are these sort of more moonshot type of technologies that can be brought in with the help of partners around the government. And there are risks and opportunities in both. Okay, so in a similar way, in every other sector will think through these things and in that way. So when we think about developing an understanding of these risks and opportunities, we need to develop a very holistic picture of how we can bring about savings while taking minimal risks in mission effectiveness, so to speak, or if you're a different type of an organization, not a DoD type, then you care about your balance sheet and things like that, much more so. But so there are near-term risks to tackle, and we need to be able to leverage on the opportunities in front of us. So with all of that in place, there are so many dimensions to this problem. What I believe we need is an AI platform, a data platform that is essentially sourcing all of these inputs in an informed way, adding a layer of knowledge on top of it from these variety of sectors. And we can start with one, and defense would be the right place to go, I think, to ultimately analyze all of these opportunities in that we're talking about, and then see what is this leading towards, so that we can ultimately, while we measure the threat of climate change and do that in a real-time way, while we measure these steps we are contemplating for action, and while we measure the potential outcomes that will happen in a time-based way, we can actually, at a systems level, be able to say, will this move the needle or not? Because right now, I think we are all very optimistic, and I'm an eternal optimist, and I think that's great. but I have lived through this once before. I'm not that old, but I've lived through this once before, from the 2008 to 2014 timeframe, and lots of good things came out of it. But then, these things have a cycle to them, as you know. So, so to address your question, fundamentally, what is needed? I think we need a system that is that can be configured towards addressing measures of threat of climate change tied to national security. We need a platform that can actually measure these potential actions we are contemplating and what kind of risks it will present to these stakeholders, whether they be financial risks or they be risks of mission effectiveness for their customers or whatever that might be. And then ultimately, we also be able to measure the outcomes as they happen. So in doing that, you're creating a memory and a continuity, which is automated and encoded into a platform, which can, but frankly, exist for posterity. And then it's not a book, it's actually getting smarter every day. So that's how I'm thinking about it at a philosophical level. And I would say, the work we're doing with the DoD right now would be perfect it would be a perfect complement to what is being talked about here from Mike's perspective or from Brian's perspective, and especially from Joe's perspective, who's sort of looking at it holistically across the board. Because fundamentally, these are investment decisions, right? These are decisions of moving resources from where they could have been. Resources are going to be limited unless we start printing more money. They are going to be limited. And as that means that we will take things away from what we think is not working towards things where we want it work. And if that be the case, we want to ensure that we understand the risks and opportunities that we are playing in here. Our platform called Guardian has been at play for the last several years with the US Air Force in particular, and they're the leaders in this. And they're doing some amazing things, which Joe mentioned, and Brian and Mike also mentioned in terms of wing design, in terms of re-engineering, in terms of alternative fuels and things like that. But the real question ultimately from an operator's perspective is, hey, will this compromise my mission effectiveness? And then everything is unacceptable. So that our platform called Guardian, which is an AI ecosystem, is helping make those investment decisions, not just for climate change, but overall for the budget of these services, to ultimately, in a threat-informed, in a timeline-informed way, be able to produce the most cost-effective as well as fiscally responsible budget that would move the needle against a variety of threats, including climate change.
Thank you very much, Anshu. So, Joe, I want to bring it back to you, given that you've got the ball now for taking both President Biden's executive orders and the DoD climate adaptation plan, plus all the other plans, plus the application of the First Movers Coalition, all those commitments, okay? And you got to translate them down to the services and hold them to account for results, right? So speak a little bit to how you want to do that, how the industry can be helpful here, and what additional tools you need.
Great. Well, thanks, Sherri. And emphasizing a few points that were made by Mike, Brian, and Anshu, and that's one, supply chain. We can't. When we look at the Department of Defense's contribution to the climate and our greenhouse gas contribution, we can't. It's not realistic for us to ignore the supply chain, and our supply chain itself is a huge contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, not just our own operations. And I wanted to flag for the group and our whoever's watching us out there, the department put out a what I think is a very aggressive, forward-leaning notice in the Federal Register. It happened right over the holidays, so folks might have missed it, but this is around greenhouse gas disclosure by our supply chain to allow us to look and see what are the actual impacts, greenhouse gas impacts of our suppliers, and then second, to think about what do we do about those and how do we consider those in the context of future acquisitions. I think the president put out an executive order on financial risk disclosure for climate impacts, and this was supply chain disclosure was part of that. And we are really leaning forward into that. And I think it's really important to work with partners like General Dynamics and Boeing, both of whom actually volunteered to participate in the disclosure program and leaned into this with the department. So I wanted to make sure people knew about that. I think Brian was the one who emphasized supply chain. I think on sustainable aviation fuels, a longer conversation about that. I was at Navy when we were running the Great Green Fleet and had some major acquisitions of sustainable aviation fuel or sustainable fuel in general. It was actually a lot of it was for our ships going off the West Coast. And I think great performance. Those fuels performed well, but we have some challenges there. And I don't know if the market moved as much as we would have liked at that time. I don't think there's as much capacity in the market as we would have hoped based on some of the actions we took before. And then to Anshu's point, the importance of data, and Sherri, this goes to the core of what we at the department need to do. We need to have a much better understanding about what it is that we use, both water, not just our fuel, but our electricity, our waste and water, in order to figure out how we can change. And we need a better understanding. And as a department, I think this is something that the Deputy Secretary has emphasized. We need to be a much better data-enabled department, and that's something that we're going to work on. As far as what we're doing in the climate office and how we're working with the services, we have obviously some marching orders under the President's executive order. There are some of those technologies that some of those things that we can do with existing technology, right? I don't think the Department of Defense doesn't need to transform the market for electric non-tactical vehicles. The market's going to do just fine on its own. We're all moving aggressively to that. So we need to be in a position to transform our own operations to make sure that we can accept those into the fleets of our services, and that we can enable our service members to use electric vehicles at their when they're on installation. So we don't need to do market transformation, I don't think, on non-tactical vehicles. Similarly, on renewable energy procurement, we're going to move towards the President's objective of 100% renewable energy procurement, but I think the market for renewables is pretty mature. Obviously, there are things that new technologies are going to enter the market, but buying electricity on the market for renewables is pretty mature. I'm not sure the department is going to change the industry around renewables procurement, though we may challenge the business model a little bit as we try and achieve the President's objective of getting to a 24/7 load matched renewable energy procurement. That's gonna, there's some companies out in the, I know Google's done some work on that. There's some companies who are out with those kinds of procurements, but we at scale can maybe transform the business model for some renewables coming to market. Whether we're gonna change, solar panels or wind turbines, I don't know that that's the case. But then there are these harder markets, and I'm interested in a discussion with the folks on the panel about some of these other changes that we need that really require transformational innovation of technology, and how does the department best communicate a demand signal that is helps spur that market and also maintains a reality around our ability to deploy emerging technologies at scale. Look, we have to walk before we can run. So I'd be really interested in feedback from folks on the panel here about, like, what are those places where we think we could kind of make the kind of first movers changes in hard to abate sectors, and what do you need to hear from the department in order to make progress on those? Over to you, Sherri.
Right, that's great. I want to let Brian, Mike, and Anshu weigh in on that, and at the same time answer, I think, a related question that our colleague John Conger has in the chat, which is, so if DoD is a first mover, does that mean that DoD is going to commit to buy sustainable aviation fuels when it's available at scale and price parity? And do you need to commit to a cost premium for reductions in emissions, or simply send the signal that you'll buy the advanced technology when it's cost competitive? Okay.
Do you want me to answer that, Sherri?
Sure, please.
First, I mean, the folks can talk about the state of technology in the market. DoD, I mean, look, we put out our large scale fuel purchases are run by the Defense Logistics Agency. There's a bidding auction that runs there. Part of our job at the department is to make sure that sustainable aviation fuels or any emerging fuels in the market are qualified and can be drop-in fuels to operate on all of our ships and airplanes. So making sure that we're keeping a pace and prepared to accept fuels from the market as they become available, and then those fuels can compete for an acquisition with DLA. Now, there are some things that we could think about doing to improve the clarity of our demand signal. We also, to be honest, we have some limitations in the law as to the price competitiveness requirements that were put in statute about 5 or 6 years ago as the Navy was standing a bids program. So we do have some constraints. We also are doing background work on making sure that we're positioned to accept sustainable aviation fuels as they come into the market, with the acknowledgement that there's really not that much out in the market. I really appreciate the commitments by Boeing and others. We need to grow that market substantially, because I think right now there's only one refinery in the United States that actually is qualified to produce sustainable aviation fuels. So we're there as a customer. We're prepared to accept. We have some constraints, but I hope that answers your and John's question. But over to the folks at Boeing and Northrop, who I think have done some work in this.
Yeah, Joe, happy to follow up on your good comments on SAF. Look, we've certified 7 different pathways that are drop-in. We're at 50/50. I mentioned the work ongoing in 2018. We flew at 777 on 100%, and the commitment I mentioned earlier, by 2030, all our commercial airplanes will be at 100. I think NATO, the DoD can be a great partner in its own right, but also in a NATO context. I think with NATO looking at studying net zero by the middle of the decade of the century, by 2050, there is standard setting. There is working with the OEMs on the certification pathways. And yes, in the end, with a price difference of 2 to 3x right now, we're all going to have to lean in and pay a little bit more for that fuel. But I think the demand signals alone will go a long way to signaling to the producers that the market is there. Just if you look at the commitments, this last year was unprecedented. Billions and billions of gallons. I think the White House itself talked about 3 billion gallons in its grand challenge. So we're very bullish on SAF and the signals that are being sent, but I see that just accelerating infinitely if the various DoDs jump on it. The Green Hornet was a good example. The Air Force has done the same with the C-17. I know that the Dutch Air Force flew an Apache helicopter on SAF, so the technology is ready. So that's where you see Boeing putting a lot of emphasis and continue to over the coming months and years.
Yes, Mike. Yeah, just a few comments on this, because I think Joe made a couple of really good points. First, on the market signals, because those of us that sit in the part of the value chain where we sit, we are looking very intently at the customer, and we appreciate the articulation of what the customer values through documents and thought pieces such as the climate adaptation plan. And so these market signals are important. And this gets to one of the questions that was posed as I was scanning through them. Someone suggested or posed a question around, what happens every 4 years, and is there a need for consistency? And of course, we're looking for consistency, and we think we see that. We believe it's there, because not just are we hearing this from the customer, from the DoD and from the federal government, but we're also hearing this from other significant stakeholders that we have. We're hearing it from investors. We're hearing it from shareholders, and we're hearing it from employees. And when you think about the next generation of thought leaders who are coming in to our companies and to our businesses, they're looking for a place that marries the technical capabilities they have with the enthusiasm they have for promoting and preserving an environment going forward that's better than what we have today. And if they can do that through their technological skills related to airplane design or anything else related to Department of Defense, that is truly a marriage. And I talked about partnership before. That's a partnership that really works. And so the market signal piece is really important. On the question about SAFs and hydrogen and EVs, I think that's been addressed. There's other areas, though, that I think can also serve as either bridging technologies or technologies that will enable this path. And, you know, think about the role of piloted aircraft versus autonomous aircraft. Autonomous aircraft, you can design differently. They can fly longer. You can keep a vehicle in the air longer, which reduces its emissions and fuel costs. And this is, it can be a small, but then larger, and then become a significant opportunity for us to manage some of the more fuel hungry components of the value chain. And I did see that there have been some studies that are done, like organizations such as the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, that are looking at the role of autonomous aircraft. And when you look at flight durations and the significant greenhouse gas emissions reductions that you can realize, again, a simple example, but it can be a really meaningful example. And we need to look both in the center and on the margins of the technologies that we've developed and deployed today, because they can really serve as springboards to the technologies of the future. And sometimes those things that are right under your nose can really be solutions that can have significant impact to drive that endpoint that has been very clearly defined by the DoD and others on this call. So that's, I'll turn it over to Anshu or anybody else that wants to chime in.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. Just to build on the points you guys made, I think you know, the US is a good example of what I'm thinking is, you know, it was never built for addressing climate change, but it became a good platform to innovate on over time. And I think as we spend our time in the building, talking to multiple stakeholders within the DoD, the one thing that comes to mind is that, you know, a lot of the operations today rely on ancient processes, ancient technologies, where there is so much opportunity to bring about savings in terms of fuel costs, in terms of emissions, and so on. And we've done a lot of work with the Defense Logistics Agency on the fuel problem, in particular the global fuel supply chain problem, and how to quickly figure out how do you get fuel from A to B in an operational setting. Just doing that, we realized how much one could save, not just for the taxpayer in terms of the budget, and potentially be able to use those resources in other ways, but furthermore in terms of emissions. And this particular solution could be a platform, again, a foundation, not a platform, but a foundation for running what-if analyses on different kinds of fuels and what kind of risks and opportunities that would create in an operational setting when one is specifically looking at theaters like Indo-PACOM. So I just wanted to address those two pieces.
Okay, good. Thank you very much, Anshu. We've got a bunch of really good questions, so I want to turn to some of those now. I'm going to take the first and the last in the chat right now for how do you incentivize investment when existing technology is still profitable? That's a good challenge, Joe. I know you want to address that. And then our efforts underway by DoD to collaborate with other partner nation militaries to achieve similar objectives and grow market demand signals for future technologies. I know, Brian, you talked about NATO. I think their climate strategic plan and their effort on standard setting could do just that. But I'd also be interested if you see opportunities with other, even beyond the non-NATO nations, since your companies, of course, all work globally. Over to the panelists.
So Sherri, thanks for that. One thing I did see a question in the panel that I wanted to make sure I addressed, and because there was some reporting out there as well on this, suggesting that DoD is exempted from the president's executive order requirements around federal sustainability. And just to say that that's actually not accurate. The department is fully committed to the objectives in the sustainability executive order. We're moving aggressively in many sectors, because we think this is the right thing to do. It's right for DoD, it's right for the climate, and it's good for the mission. So by no means is the department exempted. In fact, we are leading the way in many of the spaces that are in many of the initiatives that are articulated in the president's executive order. Now, that's not to say that some of our operational assets, a reflection of reality would be that it's highly unlikely that the Department of Defense, for example, is going to get to a zero emissions air fleet by the timelines set in the executive order for what are really targeted non-technical assets. So but that doesn't mean that the idea that we may not get to zero emission tactical vehicles in 5 years does not mean that we're not committed to make significant fundamental changes in what we buy and how what we buy is supported with fuel and the associated greenhouse gas emissions. So I just want to make sure that's clear to everyone. Is there's no blanket exemption. The department is working hard. I spent a lot of hours of the day working on that. A question around, I would love to kick over to the panelists on how do you incentivize change when legacy lines are profitable. That is a really interesting question for me, and one that I'm probably not best positioned to answer, but the folks from industry probably are. And then we can talk about NATO. You know, the secretary's had probably an unprecedented level of discussions with bilateral partners in this administration around the importance of climate, whether they be at NATO, whether they be with the UK or other allies and partners around the world. He's spoken more and led more on this than I think any secretary in history, both publicly and privately. And so I think I think this is a fundamental shift and a recognition of reality that climate change is a real security challenge for the United States, our allies and partners, and improving our resilience gives us not only an advantage in operations, but it gives us a strategic advantage when climate impacts others who may not be as resilient as we. So really leaning into that. But I'd love to hear from industry about that incentive question.
Mike, I'll take a quick shot. Look, investing in R&D and in technology is in our DNA, and it's our license to continue. So Boeing over the last 10 years has spent about $60 billion in advanced technology and R&D. Over the last 5 years, the top defense and aerospace companies invested $75 billion as an aggregate. So that is one, fueling the pump of innovation and technology was one reason. The other reason, frankly, is we've committed to reaching net zero by the middle of the century. That is a bold, ambitious target. And as we're looking at our different scopes, our own operation, our customers, our supply chains, our products in use, we're going to have to continue to invest, and that's a good thing. So I think it's not as sort of binary as the question is posed. Very quickly, in addition to NATO, just one example that comes to mind for me is the work we're doing in Australia on a platform called Air Power Teaming System, or the Loyal Wingman. So a drone that assists pilots and helps and so the mission effectiveness there. We're designing that program from the ground up to be in Australia to be sustainable, and looking at the production system and sort of the future growth of the platform. So I think Australia and the Air Force down there is leaning forward. And as we're talking about that platform itself around the globe, it's just one more example where things don't always have to be invented here. I think the relationships the Department of Defense has around the globe really enables this partnership and this collaboration. So over to Mike.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. And just one more comment on this, because I don't know if we're at time, Sherri, but I wanted to underscore, as we talk about incentivizing change when these legacy programs have been very profitable, and they'll continue to be profitable. It's really the role of technology and the research that went into the development of the initial or legacy technology, to use the terminology used in the question. And it's taking that platform and it's understanding how can we modify it in a way that meets some of the future needs that have been very adequately described by the customer, and in ways that we feel as a technology leader and others that are in our space feel that can help to drive that low to no carbon future. And so it's not that that we see technology development as being kind of the enemy of existing products that are in the marketplace. Rather, it's the exact opposite. It's not an or proposition, it's an and proposition. How can we take what we have today and make it better based on the years of investment and research that have gone into the development of the amazing technologies that we see today?
So if I may add just a couple of thoughts there, I think in order to incentivize what would be called innovative, the new stuff, when the old technologies are still profitable, it's really important to also ask how could we do a better job with current operations, with existing technologies to bring about incredible savings, incredible ways of meeting emission goals and things like that. And to give incentives and specific sort of additional resources towards agencies and organizations that are headed that way. Because what happens is that just if you take AI, for example, and apply that to existing sectors in multiple ways, there are enormous efficiencies that will come about as a result of that, and at very low risk, because that requires simply much more information to come together, much more analysis, and workflow modifications to incorporate such systems. This will create, in my opinion, a very nice pathway for making some higher, bigger bets, and which will take time, right? I mean, gathering those kinds of resources to put into bigger bets takes time, unless it comes from the president, I suppose. And that is where I think, and there's an additional need to ask, how do we get from where the FMC is today, which is asking for demand signals to be created, and a lot of partners have signed up, and that's great. But then the conversation seems to be right now that there are lots of things happening which are good, but again, bringing it about in a holistic way is really important, so everyone can have a shared understanding of what we're talking about.
Thank you. So I just want to be clear that we have extended this till 11:15 for everyone that can stay. So we're going to go until that time because we have some more good questions. And some of the ones I would like to get to before we end are, I would love for Joe and our other speakers to address the question. One, are there other sectors beyond aviation fuels where you think DoD's demand signal can be important, and either in the other 7 of the first mover coalition sectors, the shipping, trucking, cement, steel, or even outside of that? And then I also, John Conger has a separate but another good question in here. Could DoD partner with civilian airlines plus FedEx, UPS, et cetera, to convey a unified front demand signal for SAF or other emissions reductions technology? And civilian airlines, of course, dwarf DoD's emissions after all, he notes.
So I guess that one's to me. I wanted to make sure I rounded out what Brian and Mike's comments earlier, and to say that DoD also has a role, look, in making sure that we're transforming markets even where existing lines of business are profitable. We have to put our demand signal. We have to be clear on what we want, and we also have to invest our own R&D, right? We have a big research and development enterprise at the department and across the federal government, and we need to be leading the way with our partnerships in the private sector. But so by no means does the department or the federal government uninvolved in helping to transform markets by its sheer demand signal, which is really what the First Movers Coalition, I think, is about, is how do we figure out that private-public partnership on that. So Sherri, the question from John is, I mean, there's always opportunity for partnerships. Obviously, we operate with different constraints in the private and public sector, but there's always an opportunity. I think that is probably largely what drove the president's grand challenge on sustainable fuels, is let's bring government and industry to the table, see what each of us can contribute to market transformation in this space, and then let's get on with it, because we have a clear need, a clear demand to change the way that we're doing things. So I think, to John's point, yeah, those kind of partnerships are always the best when we can work hand in hand with industry. And Sherri, I forget your other question, or maybe it was one over to Brian, Mike, and Anshu.
Let's let the others jump in here on the it's on the other sectors beyond the aviation fuels that you think are where DoD's demand signal is going to be important.
I mean, steel, cement, we use a lot of steel, we use a lot of cement, aluminum. I mean, I can't speak at the moment to what our proportion of that market is, but we are big customers in the concrete, cement, almost every sector you can possibly imagine. There may be some thoughts from the group.
Yeah, we're not big into cement, but I think I think on the fleet renewal, the first pillar of the 4 that I listed, again, as Joe just said, I'm just going to repeat it. The signals the department is sending on delivering mission assurance and efficiency at the same time. These are 2 sides of the same coin. They're not in tension with each other if you do it right. And I gave some examples of the type of procurements underway that are taking a significant amount of CO2 and emissions out of the air. And I think we can continue on that journey as we keep plowing technology and innovation into more efficient products. DoD is one of our largest customers out there, period, is doing a lot as it stands. So nothing else to add there, Sherri.
I guess the only thing I'll add is a recognition of the role of infrastructure materials. When I think of Hurricane Michael, sorry, it was named Michael, but Hurricane Michael in 2018 and the devastation that it created and caused at Tyndall Air Force Base. And I mean, that really calls for a more resilient Department of Defense. And Department of Defense, of course, is going to be looking at what are the new age, more sustainable, more resilient materials that can be utilized in order to better withstand some of the future changes that we're going to see in the climate that are going to continue to have an impact on the installations that we have here in our country and around the world.
Right. I want to underscore that because that obviously, as we improve the resilience of military bases, so subject to climate impacts from hurricanes, floods, and wildfires, and the billions it's already cost American taxpayers because of the devastation at Michael, at Lejeune and at Tyndall and at Offutt and at other locations. So sort of the sustainability and reducing emissions of the steel and the cement and the aluminum that goes back into building those bases and others like it back better should be a meritorious and positive cycle there. And so, and that's another way in which I think DoD its bases being like small communities and working with communities and like cities, small cities can lead by example in this area. Okay, we've got just a couple more minutes. I know there was a question about DARPA and their innovation. I did actually have a chance to talk to DARPA just recently, and they are very big on looking at a number of these areas in terms of hybridization of existing vehicles, electrification of even watercraft, persistent ISR, batteries, hydrogen. So, and even EV charging for military bases, which is an area that I think, has a lot of promise as well. But harnessing all the technology innovators, both within the defense industry and also within the Defense Department, is also a real opportunity. And welcome any of you to address that. Or if, Joe, you want to talk to some of the challenges you're facing and what you want from this audience to help you do your job better.
So one thing I would kick over to Anshu, and I would be interested. Look, the role of data and AI in ensuring that we make we're able to look at ourselves in ways that haven't been possible before. And I think that our ability to kind of integrate that not only into our technology development, but really into our operations to find efficiencies. I'm interested in that's a sector that's not it doesn't fall under any hard to abate sectors, but may apply across sectors, and certainly applies to the Department of Defense. We have a ton of data in the department. We don't always analyze it and understand it as well as we could to improve our own efficiency. I'd be interested in hear Anshu on specific applications that he sees for improving our greenhouse gas performance, or what he's seen in the private sector of using AI to enable that kind of efficiency.
Joe, thank you. So I would make 2 points for now. One is, I think think about future decisions and decisions for the future, I'm sorry. So investment decisions where one can easily add the climate perspective, emissions as a constraint as one goes about optimizing those decisions. and then see what kind of implications that has in terms of potential vulnerabilities it opens up in terms of mission effectiveness and so on and so forth against threats that are security related. So that is a piece that's highly mature, and we are operationalizing it right now with the Air Force. I'd love to show you how we do that. It really addresses a wheel of questions, going from how is the threat evolving to how do we accelerate change in terms of options? Should we invest? How do we pay for it? And how might stakeholders react, which is really something that the DoD has to figure out in terms of multiple, so many hundreds of board of directors that you have to report to. So there are these, there's an entire set. The second piece, which is I think very relevant, is on the operational side of the house, which is really about optimizing supply networks in a global way, so that, again, with some specific goals in mind, and very large number, but defined set of constraints that are all measurable. So we do that work with a lot of major commands and COCOMs, and we have been. I have to say that type of solution it brings about a lot of it raises a lot of eyebrows, and people just at some point begin to panic how powerful it gets, how fast, because it's a very complex problem. But at the same time, there's an enormous change management required to get it to operationalization, and we're dealing with many of those challenges right now. So, but would love to talk to you more about that.
Thank you. That was great. I'm going to give Brian and Mike any last comment you want to make before we wrap up.
Hi, Mike.
Sure. Just one final comment on kind of the role that we play as technology providers that create the next generation of products that are not going to only seek to preserve and promote the freedoms that we all enjoy, but also do it in a low to no carbon fashion. Because this is something I'm relatively new, relative to everybody else here, to the industry, and I come from another industry where it's been very remarkable to see the degree of partnership within and across this industry. Yes, as primes and subs, we all compete, but we also collaborate on many of the projects that again drive value for the Department of Defense and other customers. And this is what is going to enable us all to collectively win. When Department of Defense clearly lays out a roadmap, and then we can all work and really focus on the components of our platform, innovation platform, and the technologies that we can bring to bear that can drive very specifically at what the Department of Defense is asking for. And it can do so in a way that meets the needs of not just today's society, but future society, which has really been the subject that we've been discussing today. So just wanted to underscore that, because it's been really it's been a notice of mine coming into the industry over the last year or so, that it's quite remarkable, and I think it's a feature that is going to continue to enable our mutual success.
Yeah, hey, thanks, Mike. And Sherri, from my perspective, first, a big thank you. What a fun panel. And secondly, I think 2021 really was such an inflection point, because maybe for the first time, all our incentives seem to be aligned. This whole net zero by the middle of the century, we're going to decarbonize together. And that really doesn't pin us against each other, but to Mike's point, it brings us closer together. So that what excites me every day, getting up and working in this space, and just bringing customers like the DoD new solutions, new ideas. It's really rewarding. So again, thanks to CCS for bringing us together on this panel.
Well, I want to thank all the panelists and the participants, because I'm very excited about this. I do think there's a lot of ways in which we can make the world a better place and achieve climate ambition to address the climate crisis by using the technologies available across many sectors, but particularly applying them where defense can help us lead. So the next, I'd invite you all to think about future conversations we might have where we could step it down by service and look at both the individual service needs and how they can also achieve the objectives, and work, of course, with Joe and his team at DoD and others. So with that, I want to thank each of the panelists for your time and your personal commitment. All the participants, I know you wouldn't be here if you weren't personally committed to these issues. So with that, on behalf of the Council on Strategic Risks and the Center for Climate and Security, as the CEO of the council. I want to thank everyone for joining today. It's really been a wonderful discussion.
Thanks, Sherri, and thanks everybody for
Sherri.
being on the panel.
Yeah.
Well,
Thank you all. Thanks, Sherri.
Thank you all.
Thanks for signing
Thanks,
in.
Aaron and Brigitte. Bye-bye, everyone.